Hello, everybody. Alexis will be joining us shortly. Wow. There's Alexis. Let me change her from unmute. Okay, have I unmuted you? Are you unmute? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
All right.
Oh man.
Okay.
This is the winner.
What'd you say? Oh, it's the face of a winner. That's what I said.
No, this is right. I'm talking about my face.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, sure.
Okay.
No, but seriously, so one thing we didn't talk about that we should talk about, you and I, very briefly, as people are coming in, I just want to say, well, first, hello to LG Stylo 5. I know that's a person. Henry, I think it's the Henry I know in Florida. I hadn't met you.
5, Henry.
Danya and Ishti. So welcome. I know you're all muted. You can use the chat. So we will check the chat. We won't be looking at questions throughout the whole debate because we want to focus in on each other. But we plan for this to go from, it's 11 o'clock on the East Coast, or will be shortly. And we plan for this to go until what? We said 90 minutes, but it may not go the distance, right? You make it that
Yeah, I mean, however long it takes for me to beat you.
Okay, 90 minutes or whatever. So that's the plan. So it'll go until at least 12:30, and I think it won't go longer than 12:30 because I have to go for prayer, even though I'm gonna still be at home. You and I, Alexis, didn't talk about any rules. I don't imagine that we need a lot of rules, but other than like obviously respect, and then I'm gonna make a, in terms of the flow, I'm gonna make an announcement to people about what I'm doing, meaning as a skeptic, so people don't think like he turned.
Yeah.
He's become an evil astrologer. He's anti-astrology. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, us, in terms that we work together and how we work together. So people don't think like there's really going to be any true animosity after this.
Yeah.
This is a mock debate. And I guess that's it. But do you have any rules or particular things that you want to touch on, like key points? I've written down some, but I'm want to hear from you.
I guess my only question is like, where do we start? I mean, oh wait, you're the skeptic. You're gonna start.
I know where I'm gonna start. Yeah, I have a place to start.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And you actually, I told you, you have a heads up. I'm gonna start the same place I started yesterday, which with a tweet that an astrologer, Victor, tweeted. And again, just to kind of bring that home, the astrologer has given me permission both to share it and also is fine with me talking about it. In fact, I want to read to you his reply because I reached out to him by DM, and it was so funny. I said, listen, I meant to give you a heads up, just before yesterday's debate. I said about his tweet, and he says, don't mind at all. As a Gemini, it is entirely possible for me to be both committed astrologer and arch skeptic. I hope something useful comes out of it. So I'm going to start with his debate and then, or his question or his topic, and then we'll move on from there. As far as everyone else who's participating, first, we like to thank you for coming in with this. This is pretty much last minute. How it happened, because people are probably, wondering like, how is this surrogate boomer going to be beating on this zillennial? And here's the thing. I had it open, and Alexis, true to her Aries nature, was first. And she wasn't only, and I didn't mean for her to be only, but she's the one who kind of followed through, and it's easy because I work with her. We just kind of went through with it. So that's how this happened. If people are wondering, like, how did this happen? Why is this happening? And the other reason why it's happening, and then I'm going to shut up and let Alexis talk some, is I have been on Twitter now 11 years. I know, 11 years. And one of the problems with being on Twitter for 11 years and debating skeptics over the years, I've lost count how many of them suck at their jobs, right? as skeptics with as astrology, of astrology. And one frustrating thing for me is how I've never been able to have like a sensible debate with a skeptic, because they always start off with the most simplistic and wrong-headed sense of priorities and ideas about astrology. In other words, most often they haven't done any research enough about astrology to be able to talk about it intelligently or any measure of detail. So I decided I'm going to be an informed skeptic, like a former astrologer. I'm just playing the role, though. I'm still very much in love with astrology, love astrologers, love teaching astrology. But I am going to play my heart of the role. And Alexis, do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of got you into this debate?
I mean, okay, so I will let out a secret that I've had for a while. I remember like seeing you on Twitter like maybe a few years back before I even made an astrology Twitter. And I just sat here and I was like, with the way he debates, I have to fight him someday. So here I am now. I mean, there's been many opportunities, and we kind of have bickered back and forth sometimes. But I was sitting here and I was like, okay, I want to learn. And I think both of us kind of start from similar areas, because I actually started off as a skeptic also before getting into astrology. Because before I went into astrology, I was like, why? Okay, like for a stupid thing that is obviously wrong, why has it lasted so long? It can't just be because of marketing. So I come into it and I'm like, oh, it actually works. So, here I am. And, also, I'm a student astrologer. I'm coming into here to learn something new, how to argue better, because, I mean, I see skeptics pretty commonly in my area. So I have to, defend myself just a bit. And what better way to do that with sparring practice with Sam? So.
Thank you. All right. So sparring practice, that's a good way to put it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I do want to say in advance, I am going to be a kind of skeptic who's more of the humanist bent. There is another kind of skeptic that we're probably not going to get in today, because it's too weird to kind of play two kinds of skeptics. There is the religious skeptic. So that might be like a part two, especially where you are. I mean, I know you're in the South. And so you probably do run into religious skeptics. I have been both a religious and a humanist skeptic. So I know that both are there. Again, for those of you who are just joining us, I'd like to thank you and welcome you. Seeing some good people here, some who've been clients, definitely some friends. Hey, Gabe Gimmelresh is here.
I see one of my clients.
Yeah, and Kelly is here, one of my students. And John Green from England is here. So, and Joe, welcome everybody. I think we already gave some shout outs. In terms of the flow, we're about to start in just a minute or so. And what Alexis and I have talked about is that, it's just going to be open. She has a moon in Aries and Libra, not Aries, moon in Libra and Libra rising. And I have a Venus in Libra. So one of the things you will not, I hope, and I'm pretty sure this is true, you will not have to worry about is outright disrespect to each other. One thing to know up front, Alexis and I work pretty closely together for two organizations. For ESAR, for the International Society for Astrological Research, in terms of the promotions that she's doing also for ESAR, and also for the International Academy of Astrology. So we're friends and colleagues. So this is not coming from any serious animus whatsoever. As you heard Alexis say, this is all about sparring and talking about it. What we did discuss, in a minute, I'm going to use some of my acting chops, and I am going to be somewhat other than myself. I'm not going to take on some fake accent or whatever, but I will be probably, and I said to her, colder. And I'm going to pretend like I don't know her. So I think that is going to be necessary for this debate to be better. So I'm not going to draw on my experience, like, but you said, blah, blah. None of that. It's going to be like, we're almost like engaging each other on Twitter for the first time, but it's live and we're talking. So that's kind of the thing about it. If you have comments, the chats are open. The cool thing to know is that we may not be reading the chats, during the course of the talk, the debate, just because overwhelming, like, and y'all can chat. We've been, if you went to the Saturn Pluto that Achuta hosted in January, the chats were like the bomb, so many different comments and talks, and also if you participate in the chats that AYA has, then chats can be they can blow up. So we determined that we're not going to get so much into reading the chats. So with that said, are you ready for the bloodbath, Alexis?
I am ready.
Whatever, boomer. Okay.
You're not a boomer.
I know I'm not a boomer, but I'm a surrogate boomer, and you're like Arya Stark defending the faith of astrology today. Oh, just another surprise. Please hang around. It's for as long as for the debate. Alexis doesn't know this, but we're also going to sing happy birthday to her. Today is not her birthday.
Right? Oh, I was like, Sam.
Today is not her birthday, but her birthday is very soon. She's having a solar return, and I'm having a Mars return. I mean, but no one cares. I don't care about my Mars return that way. But her solar return is a bigger deal. So I do want to talk about, and celebrate her and her life and her work. All right, so I have a share up, and I'm going to start off with asking you a question, Alexis, related to something that Victor Santo Oliver tweeted yesterday. And he says, good news, all systems of astrology work. Bad news, all systems of astrology work. So it's not the systems or techniques just at play in astrology, but something additional. Confirmation bias and or divinatory energy, which becomes accessible through the system. And he has as a question. So my question for you, and this is one of the things that I've puzzled about with astrology. Let's start out with something basic. How does it work? What are the workings of astrology?
How do you want it to work?
I would want it to work in some way that doesn't necessarily have to be mechanical, but explanatory. So for instance, language, we believe, and if you talk about the work from Noam Chomsky or Steven Pinker, language kind of has some measure of an instinct and then operates by a set of rules, morphological rules that we draw on, like in terms of syntax, or why we might say pugs than pugsuses. So there's ways in which we construct a consistency within a language that functions. And I've even heard astrologers say that astrology is also a language. But I've never been really clear on the workings of it, because I can get that with a language. I can't get that with astrology. And he just said, all systems work, and bad news, all systems work. So what doesn't work?
So I think you're putting in a little bit too much stock into language, and there's the assumption that language has a system. Indeed, language can have certain rules like grammar, syntax, etc., but from philosopher Heidegger, language is the house of being. And from his philosophy, when it comes to language, the point of language, like when you try to attempt to understand through isms, through systems, through rules, you're not going to understand the whole picture, because ultimately language is reductive. So when you're asking me how astrology works, you're also asking me, how can I reduce astrology into something that I understand? Now, for anyone who's studied astrology, they know that astrology is really hard to deduce. And honestly, when you're asking me how it works, you're also asking me, what is my personal approach on understanding the language to astrology? Astrology is one of those studies where, yes, we call it a language that we all universally understand, but the personal way that we speak of it from our experiences is what differs. Now, from that tweet, personally, I'm going to disagree with the whole notion of all systems of astrology work and all systems of astrology work in a good and bad way, just because it is an extreme statement. It says all in it. It's pretty extreme. Mainly because we also, when you say how it works, what does work look like?
Well, let me ask you that. That's kind of where I can explain how things work with language, in terms of the particular rules. Like if someone says something that's ungrammatical, like a child says something ungrammatical, which happens sometimes, you can make a correction. And then if you're familiar enough with your language, you can probably even explain to the child why this is so. You can kind of have a certain kind of level of dictates. You can also say 2 plus 2 is not 5, right? It equals 4. So we can explain per certain rules within the context of a thing, of a modulus, and in terms of how something may work. So to hear something like, okay, I'll grant you all, maybe that's his own extreme, but I have heard astrologers say that, you know, they'll talk about one system or something working. So for instance, like the tropical zodiac works, but then I'll hear a sidereal astrologer say like, well, that doesn't work because this, it's more the sidereal that works. And then I'll hear someone else say, well, this works. So it becomes confusing to kind of to understand like, well, what defines working? I mean, because some people might even say, to give you another example, they'll say like, well, I know that Pluto's the ruler of Scorpio because it works. But then I'll hear another astrologer say, well, I know that Mars is the ruler of Scorpio and not Pluto. So I think the onus is sort of on you. Like, what is the working?
So if there's like, when you ask the question of how does it work, we need to find out the purpose. Like, why are we even doing astrology? Because if you know the purpose, we can probably know how it works. And that is a question that I think will vary across various astrologers, because therefore astrologers, even we differ in this camp. Because there's a camp that goes, oh, astrology works because I research and I have a bunch of evidence and I can show you exactly how it works. And they're going off an explanation where it's more causal, where it's more like, hey, it's more empirical. I have seen it with evidence and I have tested it out and it works. That works more so with the scientific crowd. My personal approach is more so of like, okay, we're looking at experience. We're trying to understand it. Is astrology a system where we can understand experience? How can we understand experience? And not just any experience, you know, the humanistic experience, the experience of being human. That's specifically what I think is the purpose of astrology. And because, you know, human experience is by nature subjective, I wouldn't be surprised if there were different systems, just because people experience their life differently.
Yes.
I mean, I was just posting a transit post for ESAR. April Elliott Kennett has a post about how transits is not a one size fits all kind of thing. Astrology is very much the same way. That's why Chinese astrology works. That's why sidereal astrology works. That's why Western astrology works. That's why modern pop astrology works. Because, I mean, everyone has a different experience. They come in different sizes, different colors, different shapes, different everything. It's all just a matter of like, where does it fit? That's what I would say.
No, but that is what you said. But okay.
Yeah.
I guess where I have a problem with that line of reasoning is and this is something I've seen similar from other astrologers, is that yes, there is a qualitative approach, and I would grant astrology that there's a qualitative approach to itself or to its line of inquiry, its purpose. And anyone who studies actual science, we know that there is qualitative research and there's quantitative research. And where many of my colleagues err, you know, those of us who are more humanistic and humanist, is that we only emphasize and relish the quantitative over the qualitative. So I can grant you that. The problem with what you're saying is that you're talking about the spectrum of individuals, you know, in terms of, you know, particular people and the idea of subjective experience. But subjective experience is not as vast as if you're making it sound. Astrologers, if we were to go to talk about the variety of systems per the individual, we would expect a lot more systems than what we have, but we don't. And so there isn't this much variation within these systems or even between these systems. So I'll give you a very simplistic example. Even between the two astrologies, whether you're like a tropical astrologer or a sidereal astrologer, if you're Western, chances are, and even if you're Eastern, as I understand and studied Indian astrology, you're going to use the same 7 rulers for 12 signs. And that doesn't necessarily vary as much between the astrologies or the people involved in these astrology. So my question still stands, it's not like anything can work, because if it were just purely individualistic, then it would be about anything working. It seems astrology straddles this line between allowing for this individual variance and then having the strictness of rules. Maybe I might, if I'm going to use this correctly as an astrologer, it's almost like there's this odd dance between the Saturnian, right? Is that right? Saturnian and Neptunian, right? Why you laugh? The Neptunian, right? So you get this idea of like what's amorphous at the same time what's really set. So which is it? It's still like, you can't go toward this individualism when most astrologers operate within a groupthink.
So I actually think it's both. And we have to live with the fact that it's both. If that's something that you can't be comfortable with, astrology is probably not going to be the subject for you. Because, I mean, here's the thing about understanding, and here's the thing about, I know how you feel, because that is one of the biggest gripes that I have about astrology, personally, even as I love astrology. It's just like, you can't just say everything out of nowhere, but it does come from somewhere. But,
so what's that somewhere then? I mean, that's what I mean by working. It's like, what is the nature? Like one particular person I was talking with recently said it was magic. And then at the same time, maybe later said it has some correlation to what's academic. And then at the same time has some correlation to nature. So, I mean, where's the locus for how we approach astrology in terms of its workings?
I mean, this is personally a question that I don't even ask, mainly because I'm very self-absorbed, but like, because nowadays, personally in my approach, I started out with modern pop astrology, natal astrology, y'all. So honestly, when it comes, because personally, when people ask me that question, I'm like, where does the workings come from? I'm like, I don't care where it comes from, because
I see. Okay.
If it works, it works. However, it is important to care. Personally, for me, I can't say for sure whether it comes from nature, whether it comes from magic. I don't know if magic exists. It'd be great if it did. And the problem isn't where it's coming from, it's what we're doing with it. Because astrology is one of those things where I'm kind of like, okay, there's different ways that it can work. I'm taking Chris Brennan's astrology course. You can say that astrology is causal, and that it's the actual planets that are actually inflicting the events that are happening into an individual, or it's not so causal. And then from there, the whole question of free will and determinism come into it. So when you're asking me where it's coming from, you're also asking me what's the root of my approach. And that approach varies across so many astrologers, which is probably why you're getting so many varied answers. So
but don't you think that's a problem? So for instance, if I were to approach a physicist, or if I were to approach, and let's not go for the hard sciences, if I were to approach even, someone who was an anthropologist, who was more steeped in the Foucaultian school of approaching human beings and looking at dimensions of power, they really can trace a genealogy of their ideas related to particular thinkers, related to particular schools of thought. It seems that astrologers frequently have this problem where then they kind of rest on, well, this is what I do. And I'm like, well, sure, this is what you do, but it's also within a spectrum of other people who seem to do it too. I think that just seems like a frail defense.
Would you be satisfied with the answer that the workings of astrology come from human experience itself? Just because, astrology started off as omen watching. We were looking at the stars, yes, and we're like, yo, there's an eclipse. We gotta tell the emperor. We gotta let him know before he dies. So with that being said, that started off just by looking at the stars and being like, hey, an experience is going to happen just by looking at this. It's rooted in experience. Astrology, look, I love astrology, but the problem with astrology sometimes is that we chose to root ourselves in an origin that is so malleable, so changeable, it's hard to verify, it's hard to solidify, and of course, it manifests as a lot of different answers and a lot of different approaches. I think there's pros and cons to it. And that's kind of just something where I'm kind of like, okay, that's something that I have to take or leave. I've chosen to take it.
Well, I mean, then it leads to some epistemic issues. You know, like it's specifically, you were talking about the predictive power of astrology. And when I say the predictive power, the epistemic issues, I mean specifically in terms of then how does astrology then predict, whether accurate or not, the things that it purports to predict, irrespective of how these work. And so we can move the conversation a bit away from, you know, the wonderful workings or non-workings of astrology into like the epistemic issues. And so, for example, I saw an interesting post from an astrologer who contrasted, again, the sidereal with the tropical. And what he said was that the sidereal movement of Saturn into Capricorn, because I know there's a 23-degree difference, right, between your two zodiacs, seem to correlate with what's happening in the world foundationally related to the COVID-19 outbreak. As versus astrologers 2 years ago talking about Saturn's movement into Capricorn, tropical astrologers talking about it, where they would forecast, you know, particular things happening foundationally related to governments and things like that, which really wasn't the full color of things happening over the last 2 years per se. Although you could make that argument that it was, you know, in terms of the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, things that have been happening with Trump in terms of the impeachment in the United States. But at the scale compared to what's happening with COVID-19, I think that's different. So when you have two completely different systems that work in completely different ways, and they, you know, foundationally, you know, in terms, since we don't know the workings of it, how do you account for that?
I mean, why does biology work alongside with psychology?
I'm not getting your connection here.
So you're comparing tropical astrology with sidereal astrology.
Yeah.
They're both astrologies.
Right.
They're both astrologies, but they kind of veer off in different paths.
Sure.
I'm comparing biology and psychology. They're both sciences, and they do clash with one another depending on where you go with it, but they go different ways. But they still tend to coexist together. The question of
go on.
Like your dissonance between sidereal astrology and tropical astrology. I mean, I really hate to make this argument, but it's like, which one works better within your own mode of interpretation? Because a lot of astrological work is interpretive. And even though the methods of like sidereal astrology and tropical astrology differ greatly, if they were to both work at the same time, I mean, depending on how you interpret, I mean, there you have it. It's kind of like, let me think on it. Can you speak on a little more?
Well, to go back to my root, which is you kind of weighing more the idea of the subjective experience, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of having this question of the subjective experience, when we talk about, you know, the interpretive power, and I'm glad you said that, the interpretive power of the astrologer in relation to something, it does depend on what model of astrology that they're using. And if to say that, oh, well, you know, it's more so, how did you put it? Just in terms of the pure subjective aspect of it, it kind of isn't if we're talking about different factors or a different modulus. And if it doesn't really matter, and I think you kind of said that, it's like you don't care as much about the workings, but the workings also seem to kind of deal with different net results. So if the net results may be drastically different, where we might even say to the point where something could be wrong, then that brings up, you know, like the foundational issues of how we construct the knowledge. Another example I like to give of that, which is a little more complicated, that might also flesh out what I'm trying to say, irrespective of the two zodiacs, because, you know, I know people might approach that as, you know, they're just two different dialects. And I think you were going along that, or two different aspects of one branch. Let's say when it's a completely different branch, like astronomy versus astrology, right? Which have different purposes. I love that you started off the debate in talking about clarifying the idea of purpose.
Mhm.
Astronomy isn't so much centering the human experience per se in its exploration of the stars. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. With that said, astronomers are discovering other planets, other points like Sedna, Quaoar, even we could say astronomers discovered Pluto. It's kind of this mixing point between Uranus and Neptune, although Neptune was also discovered by astronomers. So I guess the question is, when we're talking about astronomy and astrology and astronomers discovering these other planets, these other points, giving them names, how do astrologers find the meanings to be associated with these particular planets, the interpretive power? So for instance, let's take Pluto. So astrologers said, you know, they actually got a kid. You know, I think you should name it Pluto. Okay, cool. Let's name it Pluto. Then astrologers started talking about all these different meanings related to death and, you know, depth and intensity, all these other things. Where'd that come from?
So there's different places where it can come from. Mythology is one place that I've seen. Another, I mean, the way that in my understanding of how delineations and planets are given meaning is that over time, over a very long course of history, astrologers have looked for patterns. I think patterns is the key word here. And they look at the planets. Yeah, they'll look at the planets and planetary patterns, and they're like, okay, this pattern, it's seemingly consistent, and like you repeat that process over the course of many, many years. So, gosh, sucks to be an astrologer. There's different ways to answer the question. You can say mythology. You could say looking at patterns over the course of many different years. I mean, it's more just like, what's your personal process of making a firm, solid answer? Personally, for me, I'm more on the side of like, okay, we'll look at these delineations, see if they repeat. The more they repeat, the more we solidify it. Because I'm pretty sure that's how we got the meaning for Mars, meaning conflict, separation, severing, etc., etc.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know if the historical data confirms that. I mean, from what I've read from other astrologers, including, you know, you mentioned Chris Brennan, and especially Babylonian, there's certain associations. So for instance, you know, we can see Mars nicely in the heavens right now, and Mars is red. And so there were certain significations given with Mars that related to redness, you know, whether that's being flushed in the face, anger, all those things. So we get that, you know, and then also I think there was the perception, as I understand it, Saturn was viewed as the farthest most outer planet. So the idea of whether you relate that specifically to mythology, and then it's also a question of which mythologies are you talking about, because remember, the Greeks readily absorbed other mythologies, not just within their own strata, but also from Babylon. You know, that Nergal became Jupiter, and I'm blanking on the name for Mars. No, Marduk became Jupiter, and Nergal became Mars. So, you know, we have these transformations that have happened, and so these associations have continued. Mm-hmm. But it's different for these outers, right? Because, okay, we make a mythological association, but astrologers didn't have enough time to observe the patterns of Pluto before they started designating them. So that brings up again, like, what is the consistent logic, the syntax, the morphology that's at the bedrock of astrology, which seems to elude a lot of astrologers. And yes, I am seeing a question. I mean, I'm seeing some in the chat, and someone says, did ancient astrologers name the planets after observing their effects? We don't fully know.
I mean, when it comes to finding a consistent working logic underlying astrology, would you
work with these patterns, patterns that you're talking about?
there are patterns, but patterns are also reductive. Just because, I mean, when you say there's a pattern, we're assuming there's a pattern. When we see point A to point B, we're assuming there is a point A and a point B. What if, like, I mean, to all astrologers watching, what if we're watching just a mishmash of ambiguity, and we're only pointing out A and B just because we see that same little thing in that, you know, when we say point A to B, when we see that consistently, is that really painting the whole picture?
Well, that's what I would ask. So, I mean, like, what picture are you painting? How do you know you just don't have confirmation bias?
I mean, we paint the picture that helps us live, exist, which is a weird problem.
Okay.
But, you know, to answer your question on whether there's a consistent working logic with astrology that underlies it, I personally accepted that, like, there probably isn't. And there probably isn't for other subjects either, however much they would like to prove it. Let's take science for an example. Science.
Which branch of science?
Let's start off with, let me try, maybe like physics.
Okay.
Physics and chemistry.
Okay.
So let's talk about temperature. So, took a philosophy of science class once. When people try to figure out temperature and how to figure out a system of temperature, there was no set way on trying to figure out what temperature was. When it came to boiling water, they were like, okay, how should we measure boiling water? When it's at a soft boil, at a hard boil, or like a medium boil? Like, what was the definition of boiling at that point? Scientists, over the course of history, they had to find many different ways on trying to measure temperature. The main philosophical issue that they were having was, how do we adequately measure something? How do we standardize a way to understand something? If you're asking for a standardized way of understanding astrology, maybe at the baseline, we have planets, houses, aspects, signs. Those are probably the 4 building blocks that we have. That's kind of like your starter kit to your DIY project. But like, at the end of the day, no one's gonna make the same DIY project. Someone could make a scrapbook. Someone could make a bookshelf. Someone could make a lot of different things. And because humans are so creative, they're gonna be drastically different. And whether to judge the merit of those differences, I don't know. Who can judge that? Like, do I have the right to judge the merit of another system created by another person with a different experience that I don't know of? And how can I say that?
Say that again, that last part.
Do I have the right to judge the merit of a system of a person's whose experiences that I don't know, and they have experiences that I'll never live through? How can I, with my own personal experience, accurately judge the merit of another system, which was created from another person's experience that I will never be able to understand?
You've kind of gone back to individualism.
Yeah, I have.
Which, again, brings up its own particular issues because, it's direct contrast, as I started with, astronomy, a disciplinary issue, an episteme issue. And for those who are listening who are not familiar with that word, episteme is just a fancy way of talking about a body of knowledge. One fallacy in terms of how you framed that just now is that, yes, science, and particularly, let's say, physics, did have to stumble along in terms of what became a definition for a standard way of boiling until it did, which is an actual system. Either you're going to use it and measure it by Kelvin, or you're going to measure it by Celsius, or you're going to measure it by Fahrenheit. But I know at the temperature, Fahrenheit, at which water boils or is expected to boil if it's water. So, there's an empiricism that informs most dimensions of science. We understand the logic by which, or I should say the syntax, the morphology under which science operates, especially in terms of physical. So, but what I'm hearing from you is that there's an interpretive measure for astrology, which I'm willing to grant. You even said it early on that it's qualitative, which again is fair, it's more experiential. My problem then is then how do astrologers, because even the more subjective sciences or art or bodies of knowledge, as to say, psychology, economics, sociology, they come up with particular metrics or ways of establishing patterns that fit a particular idea. It seems that astrology is a lot more elusive. So for instance, let's start off with a question that I'm reframing.
Mm-hmm.
Pluto. Let's go back to Pluto, for example. Pluto's a great example of the issues that I think many astrologers are facing. And it's interesting because I know from astrologers and, studying astrology as I have, that, Pluto has a lot of significance in terms of what the depth and all these other things that you guys put with it. Pluto has been demoted for a reason as a planet. But astrologers still use it as a planet. And then there are other astrologers who start talking about, well, actually, I think Chiron should be the ruler of Virgo. But Chiron isn't astronomically even a planet. So what constitutes a particular thing in astrology? Again, like in terms of its workings.
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I might just give disappointing answers too, because I am agreeing with you when it comes to Pluto. Like in other asteroids, look, like personally, I'm a modern / traditional astrologer with traditional leanings, but my main issue, I agree with your issues with Pluto. Pluto has only been around for a few years, or not a few years. It's been a while, but not like a long while. And then, with certain asteroids, they haven't been around for a long while either. I also kind of sit there and think, okay, why did you make this meaning? Especially if you don't have any empirical backing on it. Now, that is a question that I personally can't answer from my perspective, just because in my perspective, I am also a bit skeptical about it also, coming from a traditional perspective. Because, when you're, I think another thing to think about is like when you discover something new, I'm not gonna like tell astrologers that there's nothing with Pluto. Like when it comes to Pluto's meaning, I'm not gonna debate on it just because I don't look at Pluto that critically. For modern astrologers, what they have told me, what they've argued with me and against me at some point, they've told me that when it comes to Pluto, when it comes to transits, which is, the planets moving around, when it hits you personally in your natal chart, that's where you see the significance of outer planets. And I'm assuming when you see that significance, like, individually and in other people's charts, I'm assuming, benefit of the doubt, that they've gathered what's happened throughout these various charts and then collected a meaning of Pluto. That's what I would hope probably occurred. But honestly, from my perspective, like from astrologer to skeptic, I would agree that there is something baseless or seemingly baseless, don't get mad at me, about how Pluto has gained its meaning. Because to be frank with you, I don't know where Pluto got its meaning. I don't know.
That's a question that we could ask about all of them. Sedna, Quaoar, especially the newer planets that astrologers are using. Other than what you said, that it's been the appropriation of myth. It's been go on, sorry.
Sorry. I would actually say like maybe for the outer planets and maybe for the asteroids, maybe that, argument can be made just because, they haven't been discovered for as long as like maybe like Venus or Mars. They haven't been around in the human eye for as long. But at least for like Venus, Mars, the 7 traditional planets, we at least have something like, we have a system, we have essential dignities, we have rules about the planets. And, I really don't, I don't want to like expose my traditional bias here, but like when it comes to like, the traditional planets and your argument and skepticism about, where it all comes from, historically, the traditional planets have been here around longer. And I'm assuming with time, people have used that time to kind of learn more about the planets, garner more experiences empirically, I'm assuming, and then from there make a rationale like essential dignities and whatnot. And then there you go.
Why do you think that? But I mean, why do you assume that? Why do you assume that it, in terms that there has been this construction of an empirical record based on this rationale?
Because, I mean, in ancient astrology, there were a community of astrologers. They had to agree on something. Like, there's a community of astrologers who can agree, hopefully, that there's 12 signs and that there's like 7 traditional planets and 3 outer planets. Like, we have to agree on something. And I would assume that the things that we agree on at a core is the 4 foundational blocks, which is like signs, houses, aspects, planets. So,
I mean, maybe. I mean, it seems, especially with Hellenistic astrologers and then medieval astrology, especially from what we can read from, Chris Brennan's work or Rob Zoller or Robert Schmidt, that astrologers did agree on some things, but didn't necessarily agree on everything. You kind of see the difference between how you might read Firmicus Maternus or the Methesis, and how one talks about houses and it has a difference in terms of how Vettius Valens may talk about it. And so it brings up this question, let's say, we won't talk about the dignities because that's much more complex, right, in terms of the 5 essential dignities, but we can go even more simply, like just rulership. I mean, do you think rulership kind of came or constituted, like, in terms of Venus ruling Taurus, because Venus seems to do better in Taurus? Or Mars doing better than Aries? That we came up with the idea that the sun is exalted in Aries because the sun, seems to be better, sharper, better, all those things? Do you think that's what
wait, what do you mean by better?
I mean, like, it's exalted, right? So I think exalted sounds like a great state.
I mean, it is, but I mean, oh yeah, the theme of Monday. Yeah, thanks, Jake. But anyways,
Are you going to help?
I'm like looking at the bottom of the screen. I'm like, oh, these notifications, stop talking to me. Thank you for helping me. But I have to struggle with this on my own.
I got you.
But when it comes to essential dignities and like rulerships and all of that, I mean, how I've personally understood rulerships, like, why the heck does Venus rule over Taurus? Why does Venus rule over Libra? I mean, honestly, when you kind of just look at astrology as like, a mini version, it's like an experience simulator. It's like you look at astrology and you're kind of like, okay, let's test out and think about experience, and then use astrology as like a little simulator to test things out. It's like, oh, Venus works pretty well in Taurus because Venus's objective is to connect. It's to find similarity. It's to bind things together. Taurus can really help that out because Taurus is kind of like, hey, I can provide an environment that is nice, consistent, stable, no surprises at all. You can make that similarity with nothing to worry about. However, if you have Venus in Aries, my favorite placement, Aries is kind of like, oh, you want to make a nice connection, a nice bind, a nice, little meeting, love maybe. Let's put it in a battlefield and see how that goes. So
put in a battlefield and see how that goes? Okay.
Yeah, that's my favorite way to say Venus.
Okay.
But, with that in mind, I mean, kind of conceptualize Venus as a human being. She has her wants, she has her needs. I mean, whenever I kind of looked at rulerships, I'm sitting here and I'm like, let's know Venus as a person. What does she want? What works best for her? What does not work best for her? What does really well for Venus? And what doesn't do well for her? And like, kind of repeat that with, understanding, the planets as people. And when you kind of think about how astrology is the subject for, observing human behavior and a bunch of other things, I mean, if you use astrology as a way to understand people, it's probably a good idea to kind of understand your concepts like they're people themselves. That's how I kind of understood the planets personally.
So, you go with the presupposition that by virtue of, kind of embracing, as you're talking about, the planets as people, as living presences,
yeah,
and then
so
associating them with particular signs, I mean, that seems directly contrast to the idea of the Thema Mundi, which you mentioned. I mean,
Oh,
the Thema Mundi doesn't seem to kind of be organized along that premise at all.
well, that perspective from what I've argued is more of a modern perspective, I would say, I guess, or at least, or I guess my personal perspective.
Which is interesting, going back to Pluto, because modern astrologers like to associate Pluto with Scorpio, like in terms of like, it seems that's his home. And when I've asked modern astrologers, so, but why? You know, because it works. Well, my problem with that, see, you sort of ventured into my land, which is empiricism, right? I mean, that's kind of normally where I live, right? So if you kind of come to empiricism demands a particular thing. It demands also a control set. So if I say Pluto seems naturally at home in Scorpio, that means then I have to have proven that it's not naturally at home in 11 other places, which I don't know if any astrologers have done. Have any astrologers done that?
I mean, if you're gonna go back with like rulerships with like maybe Venus, for example, I mean, we figure out that Venus is domicile in Taurus and Libra, not so hot in Aries and Scorpio, and like Peregrine for like all the other
But
signs.
how do we do that? I mean, like it just seems like there was a schema involved based on something else than just empiricism with the Thema Mundi. But you seem to be talking about it in terms of empiricism. I mean, so to my knowledge, I don't know if any astrologers kind of went through and be like, oh, Venus and Virgo sucks. Let me tell you, Jake, it's just awful. Like, I don't know if anyone came back and said that.
So, I mean, it depends on what tradition you're in. It's
so
hard
there's a tradition
to
where that happened?
I mean, I would say the tradition that's more likely to satisfy you would be the traditional route.
Yeah.
More so because I mean, from a modern route, I love modern astrology. However, when it comes to the outer planets and being like, oh yeah, it means this, it means that, even though maybe, even though even like okay, when Pluto got discovered, it's like, oh yeah, it means this. I mean, personally, I'm in the same camp as you when I go, okay, but where? Why have that association when we can have that association with maybe like Mars or Saturn, where it might also fit in that schema? So, and then with the traditional astrology, at least, I mean, I haven't studied too much, but like when it comes to a traditional astrology, at least there's a framework. At least with the Thema Mundi, you can kind of see why things like it's nicely arranged.
Right. I mean, but it seems that within the discipline, astrology flouted that in order to kind of go with a different model, with different rulerships, and then even like using different associations, and that doesn't seem to be abating. I mean, like there are astrologers I read who want to, I just saw this the other day, see Chiron as a ruler of Virgo, or wants to see this other particular point as the ruler of something. So it's kind of like, well, what is the basis of that? Which leads to my foundational question, which was like, what is the real workings of astrology? Because you're right, there seems to be a certain logic in traditional astrology. I'm trying to figure out how does that rationale, and not in all elements of traditional astrology, by the way. I mean, I think why I was also asking about the workings of astrology, and I think some people are even saying this in the chat, it's spiritual. Okay, it's spiritual, but even that level of spirit seems to have not just different outcomes, but different perceptions. When I say different perceptions, it's kind of like, I'm a Muslim, right? Let's say, as a Muslim humanist, right, we might say, well, Jannah is going to look a certain way. As a description of it in terms, Jannah is heaven. For a Christian, it's going to look really different. Whereas Jews might say like, we all end up at Abraham's bosom. So it's kind of like a whole different way we talk about the afterlife.
So the spirituality wise, that is something that I personally just kind of like handed off. And I'm like, okay, if that's your argument, you can keep it. When you're asking about the workings of astrology, I'm kind of mad I didn't say this in the very beginning. Have you heard of hermeneutics?
Yes.
Okay, so hermeneutics is about the notion of understanding.
Yes.
And it's all about relation. It's about you and the other. I love it because I have a 7th house stellium. And when it comes to hermeneutics, I think and then I think about hermeneutics in the context of Heidegger, for example, who was one of the pioneers of hermeneutics. And for him, part of him understanding the journey of understanding is really hard. Just because the one thing that you find out when you do understand is that as you keep on trudging through the forest, the dark, deep forest of trying to understand something, it's hard. Just because it's all murky, it's all muddy, it's all ambiguous, and all of that. The goal is to reach Dasein, which is the clearing of like understanding. Now, I'm assuming, I mean, from my personal, I mean, I can't say this is everyone's framework when it comes to astrology. I think it's the most reasonable, I guess, the working that best represents astrology. It's just the cyclical working of talking, understanding, using language over and over and over and over again to represent and to understand experience in many different presentations. So back to your argument about sidereal astrology versus tropical astrology. They have different ways of understanding. And it's not solidified. It's not very standardized, and it's not very satisfying whenever it's not. But what astrology does that other disciplines can't do is reflect how ambiguous and how hard and murky human experience is.
I mean, that's a pretty daring statement to make. I mean, psychology definitively wrestles with that all the time.
I mean, I think soft sciences tend to kind of like get into that area, but like, well, when I say other disciplines, I'm talking about disciplines that work on isolating certain experiences and trying to make deductions out of that. Astrology, at least in my experience, aims to not do that. It's the price for being holistic, I would say.
So you're saying embedded in the system of astrology, or systems of astrology, is a certain inherent respect for ambiguity?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, it depends on the astrologer.
Do you think that could be too much? Do you think that within that system that there can be too much ambiguity?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
It's annoying. God, I hate Neptune. But like, you know, the thing is though, can we control that? Can we do something about that?
Well, that's my question.
Okay, so with other disciplines that really talk about, honing in clearly on something. I mean, at the end of it, when we understand something, when we have theories, when we gather a lot of facts and say something about it, that tends to work consistently. I mean, it does. I mean, for example, the temperature. Yes, water definitely boils at a certain temperature, but you cannot say that about everything. And
I was just making that point. You were talking about, you made a connection between, standardized ways in terms of the sciences, and then what is different in terms of an interpretive model that exists within like something like astrology. But the scientists science and scientists can come up with an empirical model. I think I saw in the chat someone even mentioned, like, well, what is the question about boiling itself? I think that's fair, but I think the question of boiling is also going to probably relate to some empirical shift. Water boils as a point in which we start to see a change in its composition in terms of it, kind of the activation of its molecules to the point that we actually either can see it, or there's steam coming up all these particular way, or a certain level of steam. And that by virtue of that, we consistently can use a temperature that we've kind of come up and agreed upon as a measure for like, then this is at a boiling point. I think this is something science can easily do. What you seem to be saying, which I think still is fair, because you did, and I readily conceded, the question of qualitative aspects of any particular form. But my problem is still the nature and the spectrum of the qualitative idea seems so vast in astrology, or I should say, what's the word, with a lot of elision, a lot of like glide between things. And you seem to kind of gone back to, like, at times during this debate, more the individual model, but no one really completely does an astrology on just individualistic levels. One analogy I might make is that, I have a window right here, I can't see shit but a parking lot, but let's say I could see more than that and look out and see stars. I could come up with an astrology of my window, my living room window, but that would just be my living room window. It wouldn't necessarily be like the full pall and pale of what astrology can do. So it seems that astrologers have come up with, like, at least schemas, a broadened aspect of definition or episteme that goes beyond the individual. So I can't buy that idea, like, oh, it just depends on my own interpretive juices. I think that's true for the practitioner, per the practitioner, but not the practice.
Okay, so to answer your question about the individuality and the community aspect, there's there's definitely a communal aspect to it. I mean, I think that's how astrology kind of started out at first, and then natal astrology kind of popped in. But to answer your question about, about astrologers having many different quality of kind of data, I think the one thing that we have to talk about when it comes to hermeneutics, I guess, is that when it comes to hermeneutics, there's no destination of understanding. The moment that you think that you can think that there's a foundation, but the thing with hermeneutics is, like, it's always moving. There's no foundation. And that is and astrologers over time have attempted to make foundations.
Are you talking about within the practice of astrology, or are you talking about what individual astrologers do? Because I'm confused with that.
I think I'd say both.
Okay, well, I'm confused with that. I mean, like, there's a definite terminus point with some aspects of astrology. So, for instance, horary astrologers, if I say, like, is my cat dead, right? The astrologer is going to give me, like, a set answer, well, yes or no, right?
I would say so, yes.
So where do we get this idea of, like, this indefinite Dasein aspect of being?
Well, okay, that's a fair point, because you were bringing up the point about how, like, we definitely know for sure that water boils at a certain degree, and I was thinking back up on your argument, and I was like, well, do we definitely know human experience? And I mean, I don't know much about horary astrology, but what about the horaries where the answers are not given, where the answer is not found, where you can't find an answer because it's not the right chart, or it's not, like, the most suitable charts for a horary? Because I am aware that there are wrong questions to ask, and maybe, like, a wrong time to ask a question perhaps. But just because, I mean, when you do say that there is a terminus for certain aspects of astrology, like, numerous terminuses or numerous ends to, like, a certain, like, cycle of trying to understand something, I don't think that should define, like, the whole workings of a practice as a whole.
Well, that's why I asked the question. I mean, like, are you talking, but you did say both. And I could think of a clear exclusion that didn't seem to match that. But if you're talking about the whole practice of astrology, I can't dispute that. I mean, you neither can prove that or disprove it, but I mean, I mean, we could talk about it being like a hermeneutic, but there's definitely some parts of astrology that are not just strictly hermeneutical, right? It's not just about what's signified and signifier, just in the sense of, like, even being perpetual. It usually does relate to a very concrete set of things. So, I mean, I see that more in terms of natal astrology. It doesn't seem to kind of have the same sharpness when we start talking about it in relation to, a very specific form of astrology. I just want to pause for a second and let Sam, the astrologer, come back for a minute. We're at noon, and I want to check in with you. One, to feel like, because I do have one big other point for the skeptic to kind of bring in, but I want to check and see, how are you doing? Do you want to kind of start going toward wrapping things up? And then I've seen some good comments. I have been able to check through some of the comments, and I wanted to address them as the skeptic. But I wanted to check in with you first. How are you feeling?
Oh, I feel beaten.
You're not beaten. You're actually doing a good job. But what do you feel like you're getting tired, or you want to slow down?
Actually, I kind of want to read some of the comments here because
Yeah, we can answer that. I was thinking that we do that maybe in the last 30 minutes or last 25 minutes or so.
Yeah, let's do that. So
Well,
we
you
can
want
probably
to start? Okay, let me just wrap up then with one particular question, and then we'll get into the comments or line of questioning. You know, because we've kind of exhausted the epistemic issues, the workings of astrology, but I have the big data question. So the question I have, okay, I'm putting back on. I'm being Sam the skeptic. Yeah. The question I have in terms of, you know, big data, astrologers seem to have this hope about, you know, that if we can amass enough data. I know one particular astrologers also talked about this in relation to artificial intelligence. We also see the work of like respected astrologers like David Cochrane, who is going for an assumptionless research-oriented astrology that he's calling a vibrational astrology, and amassing all this particular data. My question about it, and then of course I would be remiss if I didn't mention what astrologers usually talk about, which is the Gocklin research, in terms of talking about the Mars effect and things like that. So there's this belief that if astrologers amass enough data, there will be enough to prove astrology. But I have a question about that. My question is, would it look like the astrology that astrologers currently practice? And what would that mean if it didn't for the astrology that we currently practice, or astrologers currently practice?
Okay, so you're asking about, so you're talking about how some astrologers have taken a very strong data approach.
Yeah.
And if astrology got a bunch of data, what would astrology look like?
Yeah, pretty much. If it went this empirical route that you were talking about.
So what would English look like?
That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so I'm comparing English with astrology just because, I mean, with English, can you get data from the classics? Like, can we get data about Moby Dick? What data can we get about Moby Dick? Or what data can we get about the Scarlet Letter?
Lots. Or like, I mean, we can just look at the books.
So, but what kind of data are you looking for? Are you looking for how many Scarlet Letters there are in the Scarlet Letter?
No, I think the data that they're talking about is like looking at crunching enough data that or looking at the data enough that you see particular propensities. So for instance, to say that people who operate according to the 11th harmonic, this is from David Cochrane, you can observe empirically particular things about them. So you can anticipate to measure their behavior. So if someone is very strong in a particular harmonic, they're going to be firebrands, unpredictable and unusual in very clear, demonstrable ways.
So data on the qualitative.
Yes. Well, you're quantitative data to affirm the qualitative. That's a very good way of putting it.
Interesting. I haven't heard about this myself.
Okay, so maybe we should just like table it.
No. But to answer your question, if we had an astrology that had a bunch of data, oh hell yeah, there's some astrologies that will just go away.
So what would that mean about the astrologies that just vaporize, that kind of go like Thanos?
I mean, but I mean, to give them credit, they're not going to go down without a fight. Because if you're asking about what astrology would look like from a gathered perspective, I mean, if we agree as a community to kind of adopt this approach, sure, it can look a lot like this, a lot like the system here. But you know, I don't know about vibrational astrology. I don't know about any fallbacks or any flaws that it may have. But we're pretty much going to be in this, we're not going to be in the same spot, but we're going to have to be in a spot where we constantly have to look at our fallbacks and our holes in our argument and be like, okay, what's going on here? Because, I mean, I don't know much about vibrational astrology. I don't want to like say nothing bad about it because I don't know about it. But if there is a problem with vibrational astrology, if it becomes the standard, if it kind of vaporizes all the other astrologies, we just have a new system in place. And we have to look at the holes and within that astrology also. it just keeps on moving, like hermeneutics. Yeah.
That's a good place to end. So,
yeah.
Alexis, thank you for doing
Mhm.
that. Okay. I don't know if I can. Okay, I'm going to mute everyone just for a second, right? Because otherwise we might have cacophony. And I want to do something right quick. Because first of all, I want to thank you for this debate, for going into the lion's den with me, if I'm going to call myself a lion, my moon in Leo. And just for, hanging in there. So I want to do this with unmuting all. And can we just sing very quickly, happy birthday to Alexis? And we're going to do it the traditional way. We're not going to do it.
What?
I like the Martin Luther King way. Oh, yeah, someone's like talking. Okay. All right, ready? No, that's the other way. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Take advantage
Happy
of
birthday, dear Alexis. Happy birthday to you. All right.
Anymore.
Hey.
But understand if you just
All
took.
right.
But if you ask, then
All right, I muted you all again. But we are going to read everyone's questions. We also, you can give feedback to Alexis and me in terms of, how we did, in terms of like, oh my God, why did you even talk to that old man? All these other things. But I want to go back because I saw some good points. Amir, you actually had some points that I wanted to talk about. But do you want to chime in first, Alexis?
I'm seeing. I mean, I'm trying to look for questions, but I see all these like nice encouragements, and I want to say thank you for everyone coming out. Like, I'm just gonna say that. I think. Let me see. So Amir said, when astrology is measured using physical assessments, its picture isn't being understood.
Mm-hmm.
So I just immediately thought of the qualities that make up the elements, like hot, dry, wet, cold. And when I understood the qualities, I actually used the physical assessments. I think when it comes to the planets, like Mars being red and whatnot, I think that it has been understood. Please clarify and let me know if I'm talking about this in the right context, by the way, because I might just be misunderstanding what you're saying. But I don't, I mean, you bring up a good point though, because what kind of assessments can we use to see the whole picture? Because I think we can use physical assessments for better or worse, and then we can use like experiential assessments. It's really big, but it's another way that we can assess it, like with our experience with the planets or whatnot. So, I mean, I don't know your pronouns. So Amir brings up a good point.
I think it's him.
Him? Okay, so he brings up a good point. Like, what assessments should we use? I think someone actually asked that question later on in the chat too. Like, what assessments can we use?
You mean for planets?
For astrology in general, like what kind of assessments that we can use?
Okay. I mean, I think the experiential place you started was a solid place to start.
Yeah. It's a very ambiguous place though.
It's ambiguous.
Yeah.
It's hard to assail.
Mm-hmm.
I think it veered, where my fangs came out more, was the individualistic sensibility of it.
Yeah.
Because astrologers do not operate, as varied as that individualism would suggest. So that would be my problem with it, both as astrologer and as skeptic. And that's kind of what I would pound, until I was tired, as a skeptic. But I think in terms of where we can kind of continue with the assessment is the experiential, related to like, yes, what resonates, which is kind of what we say in astrology. Like, what I didn't bring up was like the house system. I talked about the tropical sidereal, but house systems, like, you can move your planets around. Like my Venus can move from the 7th and the 8th house, completely different experiences. What becomes a truth? What resonates? What I've seen in my life, what seems to kind of go along with the significations that astrologers list out that seem to be consistent. So I think it is kind of like the bedrock of it is related to a certain qualitative that resists some dimensions of the empirical. Now, beyond that, I mean, there's still the looming question about related to planets. I am not one of those people who believes that then by virtue that we should dismiss the newer planets, but it does bring up these questions that, I think any skeptic, informed skeptic would kind of ask. What constitutes a planet? What constitutes the way in which we honor particular planets? To answer the question, and Jake, you threw her a bone, man, in terms of like helping her with the Thema Mundi. I won't forget that.
I looked away. I was like, oh no.
He really was helping you. I mean, that is the rationale that I think that makes the most sense with astrology. It is a geometry of experience. It is assigning a geometric model, because the Thema Mundi is organized by a certain geometry of speed, in terms of starting from the sun and moon. And then it also relates in terms of the season and its relation to, latitude, in terms of the sun going toward the Tropic of Cancer, and then, in the southern sky, and then the Tropic of Capricorn toward the north, and I, reverse it in that sense. But you get the idea. So that's kind of what makes the most sense in terms of a rationale with astrology. So, I mean, because that's what I was driving at, but that's kind of what a skeptic would ask, even one who's putatively is informed. What else do we see is like, there was some line of questioning that I really had some problems with. So Amir also said this, and I think Kat alluded to this, so forgive me if I'm collapsing things, Kat, so don't come at me. The question was, what about the unseen energies that aren't quantifiable but qualitative? Someone also, I think she's gone to bed now, Scarlett was talking about in terms of the planets being, that what if we actively participated in the co-creation of the cosmos? And I think that was at the point where I was drilling you about Pluto and, naming these planets. How do we come up with that? I've heard that argument. And then the idea of the unseen, the metaphysical question in astrology, because you can't disprove metaphysics or prove metaphysics, I mean, this is going to always be a stumbling block for the skeptic. I think the question about where you can kind of give, I think, a skeptic a stumbling block themselves is kind of going to the root of the word metaphysics. I think probably many of you know that the root for the word metaphysics comes from a librarian error. And it was kind of listing a number of books. It was kind of to put up a number of books written by Aristotle that says physics. And that was like the physics, and then anything that was beyond Aristotle's physics was called beyond metaphysics. So that was like the origin of metaphysical. So the way in which you can, and I think someone is saying it, and Gabriel is, because he's my buddy and he knows also like how I think, that the interesting thing that you can always say to, this is even the reason why I'm not an atheist, is that there is always some measure of a mystery that's beyond the physical. We don't know all these particular things. We didn't know like some of the basis for, the things that we use in terms of science. So to kind of say that there is no metaphysics is stupid, because there's always a mystery. And whether we want to call it metaphysical or the mystery, doesn't matter, but there's something beyond what we know and what is, kind of seen just in the physical. I mean, that's even in terms of astrophysics with dark matter. The idea of dark matter. If you ask an astrophysicist, yeah, but what's dark matter composed of? They would be hard pressed to be able to define it. So that's kind of like a way out. I mean, but it's not, at the same time, it's not a full answer. It's just like, it's a mystery. Okay, you have to respect the mystery.
Yeah, I think that was personally the answer that I tried to bring out. I was like, it's a mystery. Respect the mystery, and then if you respect the mystery, then I think you'll know what. I think like hermeneutically, like the more you respect the mystery, the more the mystery will show itself to you. So.
Yeah, right. Amir, you also said that I know of no skeptics who have read diddly about astrology and astrological literature. That is always a problem. But here's the issue. There are skeptics who are former astrologers. You can Google them. I think there's one, John may be able to help me. He's from Britain. Anyway, there's a particular astrologer who was an astrologer and then became a bona fide skeptic and antagonist to astrology. I want to say Gary Phillipson, but I don't know if that's right, but it's something like that. So there are people who know astrology who become anti-astrologers. They're just rare. Most skeptics, as you said, don't know enough about what they're critiquing, which is kind of why we were having this debate.
Mm-hmm. Let me see.
Okay, not Gary. All right, John is saying that maybe it's not Gary, right? But if we remember, you want to read any other questions? I might try to look that up because now that's going to bother me.
So, Kat's asked a question. She was like, "What kind of questions do you think are possible to use in a study attempting to prove astrology?" In my experience, the ones they've attempted show a shaky understanding of astrology's metaphysics. That was whole. Oh yeah, okay. So what I do get pissed too when people try to prove astrology and like they astrology definitely doesn't work in their experiment, and when they try to prove it and they're like, yeah, see, astrology doesn't work, bro. And I'm like, okay, but what assumptions did you make before you made the experiment? And I think a lot of my personal arguments with a skeptic is like, hey, if you're coming in with this assumption, and that assumption, I'm going to disappoint you very, very much. And I'm sorry. I'm going to apologize for that. So, and honestly, I mean, I've seen a lot of like astrologers like scattered about trying to prove astrology. Like, for example, like they'll gather things like, oh, for example, like one association that I hear about Mars in the 12th a lot is that a lot of people with Mars in the 12th, they go to jail. And they just go to jail. Like you have Mars in the 12th, you have jail time. I haven't gone to jail yet. I have Mars in the 12th house. And then like what I see is that people will kind of gather different charts, and you have Mars in the 12th. They'll ask, "Hey, have you gone to jail?" And then like and then like they'll gather like so like experiments like that have popped up. I'm sitting here, I'm like, I don't know if that's gonna work because I don't know what people want to see. Because whenever I think about what works and what not works, sometimes it's even hard to ask that question because like, even if astrology did work, can other people see that?
Yeah, which is kind of like why I was even hammering that. I mean, this is something that, what I'm always surprised is that skeptics never seem to come along that line of questioning in terms of the working. They always kind of just go along one particular strain, which is the empirical and testing model, where I'm always quick to respond and say like, well, I mean, half the shit that we use in human culture, it doesn't respond to testing in that way. But the question still is valid in the sense of how do we know what we know, or how do we get to, the source of, these particular things. In response to what Kat has asked, my thought, one, I'm going to give some measure of advice. I mean, you can take it or leave it. I don't think it's ever advantageous to try to prove to a skeptic astrology by doing astrology. So I don't think that's usually a good strategy, because even if you kind of hit things 100%, they're still going to have some larger resistance to what you're saying. So they may kind of always have some measure of exceptionalism. This is why I always direct skeptics like, okay, do research on your own, and then whatever kind of will be satisfactory for you. So even if a skeptic says like, oh, I'll pay you $100 if they're flush with cash, or I'll pay you like $200 to do my chart. I generally, yeah, I mean, you could get the money and run, sure. But the thing is, if you're doing with the intent to prove it, I don't think you're really going to be successful, and it just could backfire for you, especially if, you know, they're wrong. I think that's the key thing. I think the other thing in terms of trying to prove astrology, I think the only way you can talk about it is like what has been your experience, sort of like what Alexis was saying. Here, some astrologers go into big data. I know that there was an astrologer who was going to participate in this, but she is very much into big data and talking about AI. I'm not completely clear on her models yet. I looked at a few of her videos, but I didn't get still the sense of how this becomes provable for her. But what I would say, and this is kind of why I was asking you, Alexis, when people kind of rely on big data to prove astrology, often it's not the astrology that we typically practice, which is not to say it's wrong. I'm not saying that. Yeah. It's just, it's not going to help with what you do.
Yeah. And honestly, you know, the thing about, to kind of point back to the argument, that a point I did not bring up before, astrology is extremely applicable. It's actually a little bit scary, because I mean, when I went to UAC a few years back, I saw a weather forecast for UAC, but it used astrology. Me being like an astrology student, I never knew they could use astrology to figure out the weather. I was mind blown. There's like financial astrology, there's horary astrology, electional astrology, and like natal astrology, all these different techniques and all these different applications. I think one thing that could contribute to how elusive astrology can be, one thing that can kind of show how elusive astrology can be in theory and in practice, honestly, is how it's applicable. Because when it comes to like science, for example, they usually kind of just use science to kind of just observe the natural experience, like the world as is. But like astrology is kind of like, hey, you want to use astrology to garden? Go ahead and do that. So it's like, even the application of astrology is elusive because there's so many ways to apply it. So, and because there's so many ways to apply it, if you don't have a test or a data collection that encompasses all of those applications, there is going to be some sort of application that's going to be left out, or an application that will contradict it. Right. So it's a hard life here. It's hard.
So the astrologer I was trying to think of was not British. I completely misremembered. His name is Geoffrey Dean, and his name is spelled Geoffrey Dean. So you could look him up on Google. So he's one skeptic who was a former astrologer who's kind of become vitriolic against astrology. And he is more on the data side. And again, he was a practicing astrologer. I've stumbled across a few of them on, not Twitter. They usually don't tweet, but they are on, you can find them through Google, and then they have websites and focus on that. Robert Curry from England often engages skeptics. His website is Equinox Astrology. If you're looking for a good book on looking at the nuances, including the hermeneutics that Alexis alluded to related to astrology, I would recommend The Moment of Astrology by another Geoffrey, spelled the same way as the other one I just mentioned, Geoffrey Cornelius. Again, that's Geoffrey Cornelius, Cornelius. So that book blew my mind. So it became a book, right? Because I just tried to say that. And I think it's a fantastic book in terms of exploring some of the questions that we were looking at here from a more informed skeptical approach. He is not a skeptic, he's an astrologer, he's a practicing astrologer, but he actually tries to unpack what is the real moment of astrology, and it's not what you might think. Oh. So that's pretty much it. I mean, Alexis, do you have any other
if you're gonna do book recs, if you're gonna do some book recommendations, I think one book that I think would really, really help. I mean, I think philosophy of science in general is going to help. Gosh, is his name Thomas Kuhn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he wrote. I read one of his books about I forgot the title of the book. It's been like 2 to 3 years.
Something
It
with
was about
scientific revolutions.
yes, yes. It was about Copernicus
Mm-hmm.
versus Ptolemy and how Ptolemy eventually, his system kind of fell away. But his system looked so pretty, but it wasn't right. And everyone agreed with Ptolemy at first. But eventually Copernicus was the one who kind of won in terms of the scientific revolution. Another book that I would like to recommend to you guys, it's really good. I love it. It's called Science in a Free Society by Paul Feyerabend. Feyerabend is a he's seen to be controversial. People kind of call him as the guy who almost killed science, so he's pretty controversial. And his book about science in a free society, it actually has a section about defending astrology and like the question of astrology and like how scientists have tried to like encounter astrology over the years. It's also the first book I read about that whole congregation, I guess, with like 180 something astrologers, not astrologers, 180 something scientists like publicly denounced astrology.
Yes.
Then when people try to interview them, be like, yo, what's the beef with astrology? They're like, I don't know. So if you want to read a good book that not only helps you think more critically of science and also of astrology, it's a really good book. And then for hermeneutics, there is a little mini book that I do have about it. Megan just kind of put it in like maybe the description or like the group chat later. It's really nice. And I personally subscribe to the hermeneutic way of thinking. It's my personal way of thinking. It's really nice. Would highly recommend it.
There's another book. I have not read it, but it recently has come into my library, so I'm recommending it. And I learned about it from Demetrius Bagley, and I'm trying to find it right now. It's called A Scheme of Heaven.
Ooh.
And it's a new book, and it's the history of astrology and the search for our destiny. And I haven't read it, whether it's like fond of astrology or not, but it's by Alexander Boxer, as in boxer, Boxer. It's interesting. I mean, another time we're going to have another discussion about, because I think there are limits to the hermeneutic approach to astrology. I think that's where I started when I started to become friends with astrology. I think that can have its limits, but we are close to time. I want to thank everyone who's participated. Kat, I'm sorry for misgendering you. And for everyone else, I want to thank you all for attending and participating and for singing happy birthday to Alexis. And Alexis, I hope you have a beautiful birthday.
12 house perfection.
And, this was like my Mars return. So I was like, I want to have a debate, I want to fight, but I don't want to get bloody. So it was great. And thank you, everybody. And look for the recording. I'm going to put this on YouTube. I'm also going to send it to you, Alexis, so you can put it on your social media and whatever you want to do.
Okay, cool.
All right. Clash of the Martians is over. Until next time. Bye, everyone. Be safe.